Welcome back to another volume of Region Free Radio. This is DJ Ozzy blasting through the airwaves to bring you a steady dose of awesome video game music. And I am really excited for today's episode because I think you will hear music that you did not realize was out there. That is because these songs are tied to games that perhaps were not that well received and in some cases were just plain bad. Because of this, a lot of the musical accomplishments in these games have gone largely unnoticed. Now, let me be clear, in most of the cases, these are not bad games. So let me say that one more time, these are not necessarily bad games. So please do not worry if a game you love is on this list. Trust me, I love some of these games. So with that, let's get on with it. We will start with the 8-bit console generations and make our way to the more recent eras. The awesome intro you heard was the title screen theme to Silver Surfer for the NES, which honestly sounds like a disco rave, and I simply don't know how it could have been achieved on the NES sound chip. And that simply was the magic of the Foley brothers, who have become legends in the chiptune circuit due to their wizardry with sound chips, and in fact, their music has become the foundation for a lot of chiptune music. The three brothers, Tim, Jeff, and Mike, made their mark in the UK computer gaming scene with the ZX Spectrum, the Amiga, and the Commodore 64. The games they worked on, such as Wolverine for the NES, were not always the best, but they could always be counted on to provide a top-notch soundtrack. They also did the music for the Amiga ports of games like Ghouls and Ghosts and Bionic Commando, and I would argue their soundtrack actually surpasses their NES counterpart. One day we will delve into the careers of the Foley brothers, but for now let's get on with Silver Surfer for the NES. And the reason why this game is here is because it has become notorious for its difficulty. You can hardly call the difficulty of Silver Surfer in the NES fair, but you know what? The music itself is super easy to get into, so let us get into another track from the game, and this one is simply titled Background Music 1. And this song is typical of the Foley sound. It has a fast-paced tempo, and the simulation of a hard kick drum with a layered sound. It's super rocking and gets you in the mood to surf with the alien, so let's listen. The second track I want to show you is titled Background Music 2, simple enough. And the reason why it is here is because it really shows you how much of the Foley sound has influenced modern composers. So, in fact, you can hear a lot of Jake Kaufman's soundtrack for Shovel Knight in this track. There are probably a ton of soundtracks out there that take sound from the Foley brothers, so let us just thank them for their contribution to this style and genre of music. So, without further ado, here is Background Music 2. Moving on, here's an NES game that has never received widespread acclaim. Despite the fact that everything Konami released back in the late 80s was absolute gold, The Adventures of Bayou Billy is not very fondly remembered at all. This may be because of the increase in difficulty level in the Western version, or because its mix of gameplay was not to everyone's liking, or maybe audiences just did not take well to Konami's Fall Crocodile Dundee character. But despite all that, this is Konami we're talking about, and if there's one thing we can count on is that they would make a kick-ass soundtrack for the game, and that they did. Composed by some of the folks that worked on Contra, and they would later go on to work on Castlevania 3, the soundtrack just feels like a long-lost version of a Castlevania soundtrack. It has loose guitar strums, and it implements elements of funk and disco. It's not a very long soundtrack, so I would just play 2 tracks back to back. And the first one is called Swamp and Street Fighting, and the second one is called Gun Shooting. So let's give them a go. Let's move on to the 16-bit era, and this is where things get really interesting. First up, we have a soundtrack I have been wanting to talk about for a long time. And I first found out about it through SNES Drunk, the channel on YouTube, and he was just going through some of the best soundtracks on the SNES. And no one would expect the soundtrack to the game, based on the film Waterworld, would be any good. And if you don't know what Waterworld is, or were too young to remember, or therefore were not even born, it was a Kevin Costner vehicle whose premise was that the ice caps had melted and the world had been covered in water. So essentially what that meant is that this was Mad Max on water. It was very expensive, very dumb, and actually kind of terribly awesome. So I would just say check it out just to see some really bad just movie loveliness. And the game itself was made by Ocean Software, who were a British developer that were notoriously known for making bad licensed movie games. If there was a movie license out there, pretty much Ocean would snatch it. So the Waterworld game was a shooter, and it wasn't a very good one at that. But the music was just a whole other story. And it was composed by Dean Evans, who worked for Ocean at the time, and he also did the soundtrack to Lethal Weapon, Jurassic Park, and even the movie version of the Flintstones. The soundtrack to Waterworld, as you will hear, is heavily influenced by David Gilmour and his slide guitar. It was around this time that Pink Floyd released their album The Division Bell, and you can clearly tell that some of the songs had a really strong influence on Dean Evans. So some of the tracks like Marooned on The Division Bell are echoed in the soundtrack to Waterworld. We would also see this type of style in other soundtracks by Dean Evans, such as the soundtrack to the unreleased Green Lantern game for the SNES, and in fact, some of the main songs for Waterworld were imported from that unreleased Green Lantern game. But without further ado, let us listen to the map theme for Waterworld. So the next track is called Diving, and as you can imagine by the title, it plays when your character is underwater. And what you will immediately notice is how reminiscent it is of David Wise's music, and particularly his aquatic ambience theme in Donkey Kong Country. It's an ethereal, soothing sound that around the 1 minute mark converts into something more reminiscent of Enigma, that German musical project that was very popular in the 90s. And this one is a very relaxing track, so I just want you to just tune out and listen to this awesome song. Next, let's go into something more popular, or maybe I should say more unpopular. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest is the black sheep of the Final Fantasy series, and some would not even call it a Final Fantasy game. They criticize the simplified RPG mechanics that were supposed to appeal to a Western audience that could not understand RPGs. But among that argument, it's lost in the discussion that this game had a pretty phenomenal soundtrack. And in fact, I would argue that the soundtrack is on par with the mainline Final Fantasy games on the SNES. For one, the tracks use very good sample, and they're also quite dynamic with a lot of variety in its arrangements. And so the first track that we will listen to is Battle Theme 1, which we can agree is a rocking song that goes from a harsh sound to a more subdued tempo, which shows the dynamic nature that was not very common in songs for the time. So let's listen. Let's go on to the rock theme, which has a rockabilly sound of the 1950s that for some reason showed up in a few games of the time, including the Mother series. It also brings to mind the Chocobo theme of the mainline Final Fantasy games. Because it is a short track, we'll proceed directly into Battle Theme 2, which I just want to show off because it is the soundtrack at its most metal, with a double pedal that would just make Metallica jealous. So let's listen. Next, we'll move up to the 32-bit generation with an obscure title that was released for both the PS1 and the Saturn by a Japanese company called Sting. The title is Baroque, which is a dungeon crawler that resembles the Shin Megami Tensei series in more ways than one. It has a dark horror setting that takes place after a world-ending cataclysm, with your goal being to make your way to the bottom of a tower to atone for your sins. The game received a remake for the PS2, but by and large it's been forgotten. But its soundtrack, composed by Masaharu Iwata, is something else. It's dark and ominous as you would expect it, but sometimes it resembles a lost Nine Inch Nails album. This is not surprising considering that Trent Reznor was at the peak of his popularity at the time, and Reznor even contributed to the music to Quake. The first track, Great Heat, is industrial in nature, with metal clanking all around and a dark synth beat driving it forward. It is the same sound that would later become popular in Akira Yamaoka's Silent Hill series. The second track, titled Eriza, changes it up, sounding much more like a 1980s Vangelis soundtrack similar to his soundtrack to Blade Runner. It is subdued, calm, but still very much ominous. We will play the tracks back to back, so let's give them a listen. The next game is one that I have become obsessed with, primarily because of its soundtrack, and that is Evergrease for the PS2 by From Software. This game was a launch title for the PS2 in North America, and it was largely ignored. Many criticize its graphics, and in fact, I used to refer to it as the pumpkin game because everything looks so orange, as if the world was just stuck in a perpetual fall foliage. At the end of the day, the game was simply not well received, so it's just been completely forgotten. And one aspect that was lost in the discussion was the soundtrack, and for many, the soundtrack was just completely unlistenable. And that may simply be because it is not the soundtrack you would expect from an action RPG. It was developed by Kota Hoshino over a year after he had graduated from university and joined From Software. Because of this, you can clearly tell that this was a young musician trying to explore the limits of music, which makes for a very avant-garde soundtrack. There are a lot of sample layers, changing time signatures, and all-around cacophony. There's a strong resemblance to the music of Bjork, who at the time was at the peak of her popularity and who Hoshino has affirmed is a fan of, as well as other bands like fellow Icelanders Sigur Rós and Japanese alt-rock outfit Number Girl. So for our first track, let's listen to Expression 2, Will, which is haunting in the very best sense. second track is a bonus track of the soundtrack album, and it shows Hoshino's use of atypical instruments and asymmetric beats, but always retaining an undercurrent of melody. It is truly phenomenal stuff, and although I understand that this soundtrack will not be for everyone, I really urge you to go at it with an open mind because the excellence of the music goes beyond the boundaries of even video games. If you want to listen to another soundtrack in this vein, you can listen to Hoshino's soundtrack to Forever Kingdom, which is the sequel to Evergrace. So, without further ado, let us listen to Grace. Let us head towards something more epic, with the soundtrack to Unlimited Saga. To say that this game was not well received is a massive understatement. Everyone knew that Akitoshi Kawazu was a madman that liked to challenge players by trying ridiculous ideas, but no one expected him to simply throw out the RPG manual and replace it with a board game. There are some ardent supporters of Unlimited Saga with its beautiful watercolor drawings, but the game's reputation has arguably never been favorable. That, however, is not the case for the soundtrack, which was composed by Masashi Hamauzu, who shared composing duties on Final Fantasy X and would later go on to compose for Final Fantasy XIII. This was a full-blown orchestral suite that could challenge and even surpass the very best Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest games. To show you what I mean, let us play the Overture, which gives you an epic orchestral fanfare that gets us ready for the game. Next is the Seven Travelers, which is a piano and flute ballad that uses some of the motifs that we heard in the Overture and is reminiscent of the work of Joe Hisaishi at Studio Ghibli. This is another relaxing one, so I just want you to relax and take it in. So let's close it out with something different, and that is with a forgotten game called Advent Rising. This was a grand sci-fi epic that was supposed to be the first in a trilogy of games. Third-tier publisher Majesco Entertainment essentially bet the farm on this game by pumping a ton of money into it. The company was in dire financial straits, so the game had to succeed. Unfortunately, it didn't, as the game was released before it was polished, leaving behind a myriad of bugs. Majesco never really recovered after that, and the planned trilogy was cancelled. To compose the soundtrack, Majesco hired Tommy Tallarico and Emanuele Fratiani. By this point, Tallarico had been a composer for many years, particularly on games released by Shiny Entertainment. He's a pretty good composer that has been connected to less than stellar titles. What he can be reliably counted upon is to provide you with a particular sound similar to that of another composer. But the soundtrack to Advent Rising is quite excellent throughout, being very inspired by Halo with its choral accompaniments. The first track is called Muse, so let's give it a listen. The second track is called To Greater Lights, and it uses the same motif as Muse, but it goes full ballad with strong vocals from Charlotte Martin. It is a very good song and a great way to close out this very fun episode. As always, my name is Ozzy and we are the Region Free Gamers. You can follow us on Instagram, and we now actually have a website which you can visit at regionfreegamers.com. There you can rate our episodes, talk to us, and even read original content. You will also find links to all the songs you have heard today, so it makes for a perfect companion piece to your listening experience. So with that, I am signing off. Here is Greater Lights from the Advent Rising soundtrack. See ya.
of